The silence in the Aeon house was almost palpable, lingering like a forgotten memory and weighing heavily on everything from the furniture to the bookshelves. Sometimes, she could almost convince herself she heard him, his footsteps resonating in the hallway, his voice softly singing their favorite tunes, the gentle creak of his chair at the dinner table. It had been 2 years since Jacques' passing, but while the world outside continued its relentless march forward, time seemed to have halted within her small abode. Claire, a woman who once took pride in her resilience, found that strength had become a fragile facade, crumbling under the burden of solitude. Repeatedly, she reassured herself that she would be okay, that life would gradually become more bearable, yet it never did. His absence was a persistent ache in her heart, one that refused to fade despite countless attempts at distraction, including therapy sessions that, although somewhat helpful, never quite reached the core of her pain. The sorrow remained, a quiet, relentless shadow trailing her through every room. Reflecting on the house they had built together, a dwelling still echoing with his presence, an idea suddenly took root in her mind. A dog, she mused aloud, standing in the living room and gazing out at the distant street. Perhaps that was what she needed. Although she had never been particularly fond of animals, unlike Jacques, the weight of loneliness had become unbearable. Maybe a new companion could help fill the void. Determined, she contacted the local animal shelter that very afternoon. The following days blurred together as she visited the shelter, studying the dogs and pondering which one might be the right match for her. Each dog's eye seemed to silently plead with her, but it wasn't until she encountered Jerry that she felt a change within. Jerry wasn't the most adorable dog there. He was a mixed breed with unkempt fur and eyes that seemed far too wise for his scruffy appearance. As she approached him, he didn't leap or wag his tail. Instead, he simply observed her, tilting his head slightly as if assessing her. Then, unexpectedly, he gently nudged his nose against the cage bars, quietly seeking her attention. Without hesitation, Claire reached out, and that afternoon, Jerry came home with her. His paws shuffled across the floor as he explored the house, sniffing and marking his new territory with the enthusiasm of a fresh start. Claire trailed behind him, her heart racing with a curious blend of excitement and nervousness. She welcomed his presence, grateful for the way he breathed life back into the house. That first night, she let Jerry sleep beside her. She anticipated some awkwardness, sharing her bed with a creature she barely knew, but there was none. He curled up next to her, resting his head against her side, and for the first time in months, Claire felt a glimmer of something akin to peace. Jerry's warmth seeped into her, his steady breathing a soothing lullaby, and she found herself closing her eyes, her body relaxing. She awoke the next morning to the gentle sound of Jerry's breathing beside her, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt right. In Jerry's presence, Claire discovered a reprieve from the sorrow that had long weighed her down. The void Jacques had left was no longer an overwhelming chasm. Instead, it was filled with the warmth and companionship of her new four-legged friend. Over the ensuing weeks, Jerry became more than just a pet. He was a confidant, a steadfast presence that soothed her solitude. Jerry's unwavering companionship provided comfort in the form of a wagging tail and a gentle nudge. Claire found herself speaking to him as if he understood each word, as if he could somehow mend the emptiness Jacques had left behind. Often, she would sit in the living room, engrossed in a book or a TV show, with Jerry lying at her feet, his gaze fixed lovingly on her. In those quiet moments, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps Jacques was watching over her, that he had sent Jerry to guide her healing journey. One evening, after a particularly taxing day, Claire wandered into the kitchen with Jerry trailing behind. She poured herself a glass of wine and, upon turning to return to the living room, found Jerry sitting at her feet, gazing up with his soulful, brown eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Jerry," as she murmured, absently scratching his ears. Jerry's tail wagged softly against the floor, as if acknowledging her sentiment. Claire smiled warmly, her heart swelling with a newfound sense of hope. For the first time in years, Claire felt the stirrings of optimism. Unbeknownst to her, this unassuming dog was about to transform her life. As the days passed, her attachment to Jerry deepened. She began to see him not just as a dog, but as a true companion, even a confidant. Each night, she welcomed him into her bed, his warmth a balm for her loneliness. In the stillness of the night, Claire would lie awake, her thoughts drifting from Jacques to Jerry. She would softly call Jerry's name, almost as if she were reaching out to Jacques, and sometimes she sensed a response, a subtle shift in the air, a gentle warmth against her skin. Occasionally, Claire entertained the notion that Jerry was more than just a dog, that perhaps he embodied Jacques in some mysterious way. Though she quickly dismissed such thoughts, the more time she spent with Jerry, the more she felt he was filling the void Jacques had left. One evening, as Claire sat on the couch with Jerry nestled beside her, her hand resting gently on his head, she couldn't help but smile. Perhaps this was what she had been yearning for all along, the comfort of companionship, the simple joy of having someone by her side. Yet, a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that life was never quite so simple. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside, content to savor the warmth of the moment with Jerry by her side. Days blended into weeks, and Claire's life settled into a soothing rhythm. Mornings began with a walk with Jerry, followed by feeding him and letting him explore the yard, then spending the rest of the day together. The early hours were peaceful, the kind of quiet that enveloped the air like a comforting blanket. Claire had grown accustomed to it. The silence no longer troubled her as it once did. Jerry's steady presence brought a sense of stability to the turmoil of her emotions. But there was something more, something Claire hadn't fully grasped until now. As much as Jerry had become her companion, she realized she relied on him in unexpected ways. Claire's emotional stability, once anchored to Jacques, had gradually become intertwined with Jerry. She began to notice the little things, like how he followed her around the house, his gaze unwavering, as if she were the center of his universe. It was a kind of attention she wasn't accustomed to, yet it wrapped her in a comforting embrace. Each night, as she slipped into bed, Jerry would curl up beside her, their nightly ritual solidifying into a source of solace. Initially, it was just a means for him to feel safe, to offer companionship, but it had evolved into an unspoken bond. Claire had always been wary of forming deep attachments, especially with something transient. Yet with Jerry, the attachment grew organically, quietly embedding itself into her heart before she even realized it. One evening, as she sat on the couch engrossed in a book, Jerry leapt up beside her, resting his head in her lap. She absent-mindedly stroked his fur, her thoughts drifting. For a brief moment, the world outside faded into insignificance. She thought of Jacques, of the voice she would never hear again, of how life had moved on, leaving her in a house echoing with memories. But here was Jerry, as if his presence could fill the void, as if his warmth could bridge the chasm. She wondered if he sensed her grief, if he felt the lingering essence of Jacques in the house's corners. It was a fleeting thought, quickly dismissed. Jerry was just a dog, she reminded herself. Yet the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Jerry's desire to be near her grew more insistent, his nightly nudges more deliberate. Initially, Claire attributed it to his affectionate nature, but gradually, she noticed how much more present he seemed. One night, returning home late from a meeting, she found Jerry waiting by the door. Unlike his usual enthusiastic greeting, he simply watched her, his eyes tracking her every move. "Hey, Jerry," she said, attempting to dispel the tension creeping up her spine. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. There was something different in his eyes, something that made her pause, her heart quickening. She dismissed it as fatigue, a figment of her imagination, but the feeling lingered, a persistent whisper at the edge of her consciousness. In the days that followed, Jerry's constant presence became more pronounced. He was always by her side, his attention almost overwhelming. When she went to the kitchen for tea, he sat by the door, watching. When she stepped into the bathroom, she found him waiting outside. It wasn't that he was demanding, it was the intensity of his focus that unsettled her. It felt as though he was anticipating something, waiting for an unspoken signal. One night, she awoke to find Jerry lying at the bed's edge, his face inches from hers. His breath was a gentle whisper against her skin, but his eyes were wide, fixed on her. She blinked, disoriented, and he nudged her cheek with his nose, pressing closer. "Jerry," Claire murmured, her voice tinged with sleep. Jerry remained steadfast, his body pressed against Claire's in a manner that was both comforting and protective. There was an ease to it, a naturalness that allowed Claire to relax into the warmth he provided. Yet, a lingering thought persisted at the back of her mind. She wasn't accustomed to receiving such attention, particularly from a dog. Over the following nights, this routine continued. Jerry would nestle into bed with her, his form snug against hers, as though claiming his space beside her. On occasion, Claire would awaken to find him nudging her gently, as if seeking to draw her even closer. It wasn't just a simple snuggle, it felt more intentional. Initially, Claire dismissed it as mere canine affection. But the more she pondered it, the more she sensed an underlying oddity to his behavior. Her rational mind insisted it was her loneliness, her yearning for connection, projecting onto Jerry's actions. Yet deep down, she sensed a shift between them, something beyond explanation. Claire attempted to push aside the growing tension. She couldn't afford to dwell on it, especially given how much she depended on Jerry's companionship. She feared confronting the truth, worried that her feelings for him had transcended simple affection into something more complex. Still, the intimacy between them was undeniable. Jerry began to respond to her emotions in remarkably perceptive ways. When she felt sad, he would stay close, resting his head on her lap, his eyes reflecting understanding. When she laughed, his demeanor brightened, as if sharing in her joy. In those moments, Claire felt a profound connection with him, one that went beyond the typical pet-owner dynamic. Then, on a chilly winter evening, as Claire sat by the fireplace, Jerry approached her. He nudged her hand, prompting her to absent-mindedly scratch behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closed, but there was an unfamiliar quality to his demeanor. He wasn't merely seeking affection. He seemed to be waiting, as if anticipating an event. As she leaned down to kiss the top of his head, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a spark of recognition, a flicker of understanding that went beyond what she expected from a dog. It sent a shiver through her, unsettling yet intriguing. Claire had always prided herself on her independence, constructing a life centered around her career, friendships, and managing emotions in solitude. But since Jerry had entered her life, everything had shifted. The once silent moments of her day were now filled with the soft padding of Jerry's paws on the floor, his rhythmic breathing as he sat by her side. He had become more than a companion, he was her anchor. Each morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, Jerry was there, patiently awaiting her awakening. He didn't clamor for attention like other dogs might, but his presence was undeniable. In the gentle way he nudged her hand or rested his head on her lap, Claire found solace. More than that, she realized how much she had come to rely on Jerry's affection, especially in the void Jack had left. The house, once echoing with Jack's laughter and presence, was now quieter. Yet Jerry filled that silence in a way that felt almost too perfect. His constant companionship, his quiet watchfulness in every room, provided a sense of completeness Claire hadn't anticipated. Jerry's unwavering gaze seemed to penetrate Claire's very soul, as if he truly understood the depths of her sorrow. It was a peculiar notion, imagining that a dog could grasp the intricacies of grief, yet she couldn't dismiss the thought. His gentle presence and calming nature acted as a soothing balm for her wounded heart, and gradually, she began to see him as more than just a pet. He became a true companion, a constant presence in her life. Each night, Jerry would curl up at the foot of her bed, his warmth a comforting presence. Occasionally, she would awaken to find him near her head, his breath a soft whisper against her ear, his eyes open and watchful. There was an inexplicable intensity in his gaze that left Claire pondering. He wasn't merely a dog, she mused. He seemed to possess an understanding that transcended words, a connection that no one else could offer. Yet, beneath this growing attachment, Claire sensed a subtle unease she couldn't quite articulate. It manifested in small ways. Jerry's insistence on being near her at all times, whether she was brushing her teeth or folding laundry, was beginning to feel overwhelming. It wasn't that he was overly demanding, but the constancy of his attention was starting to feel a bit too much. One evening, as Claire settled into bed, she noticed Jerry sitting by her nightstand, his eyes fixed on her. There was no wagging tail, no playful bark, just a steady, expectant gaze. "Jerry, what is it?" she whispered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he padded closer, curling up next to her and resting his head on the pillow. Claire hesitated, a chill running down her spine. There was something disconcerting about this moment, the intimacy, the way he sought comfort felt almost too close for a pet. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," as she muttered, dismissing the unsettling thought. But as she drifted into sleep, Jerry remained by her side, his warmth a constant reassurance. Days passed in this manner, Jerry always nearby, never straying far. Claire tried to focus on her work, her social life, her hobbies, but Jerry's presence was an ever-present shadow. She began to feel as though she couldn't breathe without him, as if he had become an integral part of her life, a fixture she couldn't envision living without. And that realization frightened her. It wasn't until a rainy evening 2 weeks later that Claire truly understood the depth of their bond. Returning home late from a work event, exhausted and drained, she found Jerry waiting by the door, his eyes wide and expectant. But this time, there was something different in them, something almost knowing. "Hey there, buddy," Claire said softly, attempting to quell the tension building in her stomach. She crouched to pet him, but Jerry didn't immediately respond. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and unwavering. His body was tense, as if bracing for something. A shiver coursed through Claire, but she attributed it to the weather, dismissing her growing anxiety. Jerry had been acting oddly, but she couldn't determine if it was her imagination or if something truly strange was happening. That night, as she lay in bed, Jerry climbed up beside her, assuming his usual spot at the foot of the bed. But when Claire reached out to scratch his ears, she noticed he was more insistent than usual, nudging her hand toward his face, pressing his body against hers with unexpected force. It was an odd sensation, as though he was demanding her attention in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. Claire tried to dismiss the unsettling feeling, reassuring herself that Jerry was simply being affectionate. "Good night, Jerry," she whispered, but he remained still, his body pressed against hers as if waiting for something she couldn't quite grasp. As days went by, the sense of her knees grew stronger, shadowing her every interaction with Jerry. It wasn't just his constant proximity or how he followed her every move, it was the intensity of his gaze, a look that seemed to convey more than mere affection. It was as though he was trying to communicate something beyond what she was prepared to understand. One evening, after a particularly taxing day at work, Claire returned home to find Jerry waiting by the door. This time, there was no wagging tail or joyful bark, just silence and an unwavering stare. She had grown accustomed to his attention, but tonight it felt different. "Jerry," Claire said softly, her voice tinged with strain, "What's going on with you?" He didn't respond, but as she moved past him to hang up her coat, she felt his eyes follow her, the intensity of his gaze sending a shiver up her spine. Suddenly, Jerry moved closer, nudging her leg with his nose. Claire froze, her heart pounding. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, a desire that made her take a step back. She couldn't explain it, but the air between them felt charged, as if an invisible line had been crossed. "Stop it, Jerry," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Jerry didn't retreat. Instead, he pressed closer, seeking comfort in a way that felt too intimate, too unsettling. Claire took a deep breath, trying to push the disquieting thoughts from her mind. She didn't want to face the reality of the bond she had unknowingly formed with Jerry. "He's just a dog," as she told herself. But as Jerry's body leaned into hers once more, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more complex at play. Over the next few days, the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Jerry's behavior grew more pronounced, his persistent nudges, his constant presence, the way he sought her out in every room. He had always been a clingy dog, but this felt different. It was as if he was trying to convey something beyond what a dog should be capable of. Claire's mind raced with questions. Was she overthinking things? Was this merely a dog's natural need for companionship, or was she witnessing something deeper, something darker that she couldn't comprehend? Each night, as Jerry curled up beside her, the discomfort gnawed at her. She tried to focus on other things, but the tension was palpable. It wasn't just the physical closeness, it was the emotional weight. The way Jerry seemed to fill the void Jack had left, the way his eyes seemed to see through her, understanding her in a way that was almost human. It was becoming too much for Claire to handle, too intense to ignore. The tension had been building for weeks, inching closer to a breaking point that Claire wasn't sure she could prevent. Her home, once a refuge, felt stifling under the weight of Jerry's presence. His constant gaze, his need to be near her, to touch her, had morphed from affection into something that felt like obsession. A part of Claire had always sensed this moment would come, yet now that it was here, she felt trapped, unsure of how to break free. That night, everything seemed to reach a boiling point. Claire had spent her day at work, attempting to ignore the weight of Jerry's presence in her life, hoping that staying busy might dispel the suffocating feeling. But as soon as she walked through the door, the intensity hit her like a tidal wave. Jerry was there, waiting. Initially, it appeared to be just another evening. He sat by the door, his tail wagging as if nothing was amiss. Yet, as Claire moved past him to drop her keys on the table, she noticed a change. His posture was tense, his eyes locked onto her with a gaze that made her feel vulnerable. There was a deliberate purpose in his movements, an urgency that hadn't been there before. She tried to dismiss it. "You're just being paranoid," she reassured herself. But the knot in her stomach told a different story. Needing to clear her head, she walked to the kitchen, with Jerry trailing closely behind, his paws a soft rhythm on the floor. As he sat by her feet, looking up with those intense eyes, the discomfort within her continued to grow. That night, as Claire went to bed, she felt the familiar weight of Jerry on the mattress. What had started as a comforting presence at the foot of the bed had grown into something more invasive. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, attempting to calm her racing thoughts, but she could feel Jerry's eyes on her. When she turned to face him, she found him watching, unmoving, his gaze unblinking. It was as if he was waiting for her to acknowledge the unspoken bond between them. Claire swallowed hard, her breath shallow. "Why are you looking at me like that, Jerry?" she whispered into the quiet. But Jerry, as always, didn't respond. He simply lay there, watching her. Suddenly, without warning, Jerry shifted. He didn't just move. He crawled across the bed until he was right beside her, his fur brushing against her skin. Claire's heart skipped a beat at the closeness, the warmth. She had never felt so trapped. She tried to push him away, but he resisted. Jerry's body was a weight against hers, and it felt as though he wouldn't let her go. "Stop," Claire murmured, her voice shaking. "Please stop." But Jerry didn't stop. He nudged her again, his body pressing harder against her side. She felt the tension in his muscles, the insistent demand in his actions. This wasn't just about seeking comfort. It was something else, something unfamiliar, something that made her feel as though she was losing control. The realization struck her like lightning. This wasn't just affection anymore. It was possessiveness. It was manipulation. It was something dark. She recoiled, pulling away from Jerry, her back pressing against the headboard in an attempt to reclaim her space. But he followed. He was always there. His warmth was oppressive, his breathing steady and deliberate. It was as if he was forcing her to remain in this space with him, to be as close as he needed her to be. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she realized there was no escape. She had never felt so powerless. She wasn't just afraid of Jerry, she was afraid of what she was becoming, afraid of how she had let this bond twist into something unrecognizable. Her emotions, her thoughts, everything was clouded by the tension between them. And now, she could no longer ignore what was happening. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. She thought of calling for help, of fleeing the house, but deep down, she knew she couldn't. The connection between her and Jerry had grown too strong, too consuming. It felt as though Jerry could read her every thought, and Claire was powerless to stop him. "Why is this happening?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her despair. It was as if she were drowning, suffocating beneath the heaviness of the situation. As if on cue, Jerry moved closer, resting his head against her chest, his eyes momentarily closing. But then, just as suddenly, they opened again, and Claire felt the intensity of his gaze like a silent command, a challenge she couldn't ignore. There was no turning back now. "Please," Claire whispered, desperation lacing her voice as her trembling hands attempted to push Jerry away once more. But he didn't budge. He was stronger now, more insistent. What had once been a source of comfort had transformed into an overwhelming force beyond her control. She tried to rationalize, to convince herself that this was a misunderstanding, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. It was something far darker. As Claire lay there, ensnared in Jerry's warmth, she couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. How had she allowed it to progress so far? The night stretched on, oppressive in its silence, and Claire understood that whatever came next, she was no longer in control. Days passed in a haze, each moment more suffocating than the last. Claire's life had evolved into a blur of confusion, isolation, and fear. She had tried to fight it, to distance herself from Jerry, but each time she did, he seemed to return with even greater resolve. He wasn't just following her, he was watching her. Always watching. She had considered reaching out to a friend, tried to convince herself she was overthinking things. But the more she reflected, the more she realized she wasn't imagining it. Jerry was no longer just a dog, he had become something else entirely. Something that had entwined itself so deeply into her existence that she could no longer discern where she ended and he began. It wasn't love, it was possession. Obsession. Claire couldn't bear it any longer. One evening, she stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. She hadn't been eating, barely sleeping. And when she did find sleep, it was always with Jerry by her side. It felt like she was losing herself, fading into the background of her own life, reduced to another object for Jerry to control. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered to her reflection. But there was no answer. Only the soft, insistent tapping of Jerry's pores as he entered the room. When Jerry approached her that night, Claire felt a chill run down her spine. He had been more distant these past few days, yet something about tonight felt different. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Claire felt exposed, as if he could see into the very core of her being. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." But Jerry didn't respond. He simply sat there, staring at her with those unblinking eyes. The silence in the room was deafening. Claire backed away, retreating to the farthest corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this couldn't continue. She had to escape. But how? Where could she go? She couldn't escape Jerry, not physically, and certainly not mentally. He was embedded in her life, in her soul. As she turned to leave the room, Jerry followed, always a step behind, his presence looming like a dark shadow. Claire's breath hitched as she moved quickly toward the door. She had to get out, to break free before it was too late. But just as her hand reached the door handle, Jerry lunged forward, blocking her path. "Jerry, no!" Claire cried out, her voice breaking as she attempted to push him away, but Jerry was stronger than she had ever realized. His body pressed against hers, his fur a suffocating weight, and she could feel his breath on her skin. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. For the first time, Claire truly understood. This wasn't about love anymore, it was about control. Jerry's need to dominate, to possess her entirely, had overshadowed everything else. And she had unwittingly allowed it to happen, letting him become central to her life until it was too late to reverse it. With a final, desperate push, Claire broke free from his grip and bolted out of the room. She didn't stop running until she reached the outside, where the cool night air hit her face. But even as she stood there, gasping for breath, the feeling of Jerry's presence lingered, as if he were still watching her every move. That night, sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat on the couch, trying to devise a way out, but every plan seemed futile. She felt isolated, with no one to turn to and no way to fight back. Jerry had become her reality, her nightmare. And the most unsettling part was the doubt within her. Did she truly want to escape? A part of her still craved the closeness, the intimacy Jerry had provided. Despite its suffocating nature, it felt like the only thing keeping her alive. The next morning, Claire awoke to an eerie silence. Though she hadn't slept, she felt oddly refreshed. The oppressive weight of the previous days had lifted, albeit temporarily. Jerry was still somewhere in the house, but for the first time, Claire felt a sense of resolve. She had to end this. The house felt different now, emptier, as if something had shifted in the very air. Claire knew she couldn't continue living this way. She had endured too much, and now she faced the ultimate question: what kind of life was this? As she stood in the living room, contemplating her next steps, Jerry appeared. He stood at the entrance, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Yet, this time, Claire didn't flinch. She met his gaze with steady determination. "Jerry, it's over," Claire said, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "You can't control me anymore." Silence hung in the air. Slowly, Jerry approached her. But this time, Claire didn't retreat. She held her ground, determined not to let him take control again. He circled her once, his movements slow and deliberate, as if assessing her. And then, to her surprise, he stopped. It was almost as if he understood. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a strange sense of peace. Jerry wasn't going to hurt her anymore. He wasn't going to hold her captive. The power had shifted, and for the first time, Claire felt free. But this newfound freedom came with a price. Claire knew she couldn't remain in the house, not with the memories of what had transpired, not with Jerry lingering in the corners of her mind. She packed a bag and left, leaving the house behind. As she stepped into the world outside, Claire understood her life would never be the same. But she also knew that, for the first time in a long while, she was truly free. Free from Jerry, free from the suffocating control he once wielded over her. As she walked away, she pondered what she had learned from the ordeal. That love could be beautiful, yet also perilous. That the line between affection and obsession could blur in ways that were nearly invisible until it was too late. But Claire had learned one thing for certain: she was in control of her own life now. And no one, not even Jerry, could take that away from her.